Welcome, Dr Onni Gust, Associate Professor of Colonial History. I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about your research.
I'm a historian of ideas, really. I'm a cultural historian of the period of the 18th century European colonialism. I focused mainly on Britain, but because you've got networks all the way around Europe and then Europeans going out and conquering the Americas, South Asia, the Pacific, I look at those networks and how they change ideas about what it means to be human.
Your 2020 monograph, Unhomely Empire, is clearly an important component of that research. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So it took me forever to write. Well, I started it out of my PhD. It wasn't from my PhD directly, but it was part of the debates over what it means to be British, and that were going on in the kind of public and political sphere about what does it mean to be British in a multicultural society, from the perspective of, well, what does it mean to belong? So we tend to know ourselves when we don't feel comfortable somewhere, but feelings aren't just universal. Feelings are historical. So it's really, in some ways, it's a cultural history of emotion. But I was using ideas of that travelled around the British Empire to think about, well, how did this feeling of belonging, which I talked about as a feeling of being at home, change between the kind of mid-18th century to the early 19th century at the same time as British people were moving all across the empire. And what I argued was that there's this narrowing definition of what it means to belong and what it means to be at home, that as you get more people moving around the British Empire, so you get this kind of ideal of staying put at home on your so-called native land, whatever that is, in a little, usually it's a cottage with a wife and children and a happy family. And that kind of rural idyll, a kind of nostalgia for that develops that then narrows this idea of what it means to be home. And I think we live with the legacy of that. So this idea that there's only really one way to honour a sense of belonging.
I mean, really fascinating. But what you're saying here is surely that history has real-world, contemporary relevance.
Yes.
Moving on from that, what are you working on at the moment then?
Well, actually, that segues very nicely into what I'm working on, because broadly speaking, what I'm working on is transgender history. If you listen to the media and politics, you would think that there weren't any trans people before about yesterday.
Yes.
And you won't be surprised to know that that's not true.
What a surprise.
That there are people who they didn't call themselves transgender or non-binary or genderqueer or whatever, but they certainly lived their lives moving often across different between man and woman, or existing in different ways. So my current project looks at how encounter with peoples who did not have the same ideas about gender, sex and sexuality changed European ideas, but also how European imperial expansion consolidated a sense of you have to be either a man or a woman, and you can't be anything else. I'm thinking about it in a slightly more abstract way, so I'm thinking about what it means to be human and what role sex plays and changing ideas of sex play in what it means to be human. So can you be human if you don't have a sex? And in the 18th century, that's kind of a debate. It's a debate because this notion of the mythical hermaphrodite, in quotation marks, was disputed during this period as to whether it was even possible or whether this person existed. And the same thing with mermaids, did mermaids exist? And so I'm really thinking about these things from a kind of history of ideas and the ways that popular ideas of different bodies and different people sometimes clash, sometimes align with more elite ideas that set a kind of dominance of what it is feasible to believe in.
Right. You have a document here.
So I just, this is from our manuscripts and special collections, and it's a letter from 1750 from a doctor, a physician. So physicians were all writing to each other about strange anomalies. And one of the things he's writing about is the claim that there was a mermaid. He's based in Yarmouth, I think. He claims that there was not a mermaid, but there are a lot of monstrous beings that are circulating around this period, and people flock to them. So the elites flock to them, the working classes flock to them. They're exhibited, and including a number of mermaids. But even Darwin visited the Fiji mermaid, and it informed his thinking.
Wow.
Yes.
I mean, fascinating stuff. This is really important research, and part of that speaks to the future of this research, and I'm thinking here particularly about PhD research and doctoral research. Do you have any examples of that, or indeed any examples of particular areas that you think would be good to research?
Yeah, so I've had some fantastic PhD students, and I've still got some fantastic PhD students who are working on a wide range of things. Quite a few of them have looked at identity formation.
Yeah.
In very different ways, but all of them have been interested in national identity formation. My most recent successful PhD student, Matt Carter, looked at animals and the way that popular natural history used animals to define what it was to be British, which was fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating.
And really was kind of a blend of cultural history and environmental history and histories of animals, and it's great. And I've got other PhD students looking at transgender history, looking at decolonialism and things like that.
So the Department of History at Nottingham is well known for its research-led teaching. The research we've spoken about today, how does that impact your teaching?
I mean, my teaching is my research, and I work with my students to develop these ideas.
Right.
So I teach a second year module on transgender history, which has been incredibly helpful for me, thinking about, where are these ideas going? How do we feel about them? And most of my students, we have mature students, but most of them are young people. How do they feel about them? What do we think is important to understand, and why do we think it's important to understand transgender history? It gives me a chance also to talk about the readings that I'm engaging with, and to get their perspectives on it. My special subject I'm using this summer to redesign entirely, and we're going to be looking at orangutans and wild children in the woods and mermaids, of course, but probably also a rhinoceros or two. To think about how, I'll say the Enlightenment, because it's not Enlightenment thinkers, it's elite and popular, mainly in Britain, but also in France, understood the human, and how colonial encounter and all these travel narratives that were talking about weird beings that they couldn't quite classify, how did that impact their sense of what it meant to be human?
Wow, really interesting. So I think all I'd like to say is thank you very much, Dr. Onni Gust.